Hello friends, and welcome to the channel, where we delve into the mind of a villain. In this entry, we'll be taking a look at Clyde Shelton from the movie Law-Abiding Citizen. The film explores the limitations of the legal system and shows how far one man would go when justice is denied. For Clyde, while he starts off the story as a sympathetic victim, over the course of the film he degenerates into a despicable madman. The tragedy of the one bad day trope would certainly apply to Clyde. One unfortunate night, two robbers broke into his home, resulting in the demise of his beloved wife and daughter. What happened to Clyde was devastating, but what would soon follow would be agonizing salt on the wound. Due to extenuating circumstances, the district attorney's office, led by Nick Price, handling the case, informs Clyde that there is not enough evidence to convict the two robbers. Instead of taking them to court, a deal would be struck, where one of them would be executed, while the other, who happens to be the more guilty one, would receive only a handful of years in prison. Now, of course, the film takes certain liberties with regards to the application of law. The events and legal circumstances are all fictional for the movie, but if you do happen to know how it would have panned out more realistically, do let everyone know in the comments below. On top of his overwhelming rage against the robbers who took away the two most important people to him, Clyde is now disillusioned with the legal system for its failure to deliver justice. One would certainly agree that no matter the laws of the country you are in, a few years in prison is hardly equitable for the crime of dual murder. Specifically, Clyde's resentment is targeted against Nick, who chose to strike a deal with the robbers instead of pursuing the matter in court as Clyde wanted. We learn that Nick was more concerned about preserving his conviction rate, as he was afraid of losing the case, which would result in the robbers walking off scot-free. Unfortunately for the robbers, Clyde was one man they should have not messed with. He was a man of sharp intellect, a tinkerer for the Department of Defense, specializing in inventing weapons to eliminate elusive targets. Fueled by his rage, Clyde would spend the next 10 years meticulously plotting his revenge, studying his opponents, and becoming an expert in criminal law. After the 10 years, the time of Clyde's revenge is heralded by the execution of the first robber, who has been on death row for the past 10 years. Oddly enough, the less guilty robber who was discouraging his accomplice received the heavier sentence, while his accomplice has long been released from prison. Clyde's long-awaited justice results in the two robbers suffering a painful death, more so for the one responsible for his family's death. At this point, Clyde's action, while gruesome and outside of the law, are still somewhat understandable. Even Nick himself displays satisfaction with the outcome, expressing relief that the two robbers are no longer on the streets. However, Clyde's initial actions are the start of a slippery slope into absolute madness. He would still be a sympathetic character if not for what he does next. Revenge against the two robbers was just the tip of the iceberg, as it appears that Clyde now wishes to take on the legal system, to expose it for the flaws that kept him from his long-deserved justice. We see this in his hearing, by his now extensive knowledge of criminal law being able to quote obscure precedents to secure his bail. But as the judge is about to grant his bail, he openly mocks her on her readiness to release him, when he has allegedly killed two people. For Clyde, this is the exact kind of legal loophole that he despises, one that allows criminals to evade justice and madmen to roam the streets. Legal loopholes aside, one of the other things that we can see here from Clyde's choice of words is his gripe over how impersonal the administration of the law has been. In his own words, he accuses the judge of treating the law like an assembly line. And from how this case was handled, one can easily see why Clyde would have an issue with that. Treating legal cases impersonally may be the professional thing to do, but it does little to ease the pain of the broken victims. Sometimes a bit of empathy goes a long way. Clyde was a father who just lost his wife and daughter, yet all he received was the bad news of denied justice, made worse by Nick's cold manner of delivery, with hardly a shred of genuine sympathy. Even Nick's mentor expressed shock over his lack of empathy and encouraged him to take the case as he could have won. Perhaps if Nick had truly put himself in Clyde's shoes, he may have acted differently. Unfortunately, he was at the stage of his career where his self-interest clouded his judgment. As Clyde now mentions to Nick in one of their interrogations, he is going to war with the legal system. His steel dedication to his cause is seen by his adoption of military strategy, where he lives by a quote from von Clausewitz, set front and center on his vision board. However, in his war on the legal system, Clyde has clearly crossed the line from vengeance to psychopathy. Resentment against the two robbers and the people involved in the case is within reason, but Clyde has now descended to a level where he's targeting people not even remotely linked to the case, from his cellmate to the legal prosecutors in charge of the Justice Department, eventually culminating with the mayor and various members of law enforcement. With his indiscriminate targeting of innocent individuals, Clyde displays his little regard for human life, treating every kill as a mere tick off the checklist, a stepping stone to his overall scheme. Despite his horrendous acts, Clyde shows no sign of remorse or regret. When questioned about his extreme methods, he says that lessons not learned in blood are soon forgotten. Clyde was a product of tragedy, but he has allowed the seed of evil sown into him to grow into even bigger proportions than the original. He is a man too far gone, and to borrow a quote, he belongs to the class of criminals that just want to watch the world burn. Not even the memory of his family can dissuade him, a sentiment that Nick tries to use when he returns his daddy bracelet. Clyde doesn't deny that his actions would dishonor the memory of his family, but mentions that they are dead and thus can't feel anything. Throughout his efforts, Clyde directs his resentment primarily against Nick, who appears to be kept alive for his grand crescendo. As part of his revenge, one of the recurring themes with Clyde is his deliberate choice to use back the same words that were used against him. Right from the start, he leaves the words "can't fight fate" at the execution of the first robber, a phrase that was said to him during his assault and in the trial. And in the initial stages of his capture, before his confession to Nick about killing the two robbers, Clyde reminds him that it's not what you know, it's what you can prove in court, the same phrase that Nick used to justify his deal with the criminals. At that point, there was no solid evidence against Clyde, a fact that he takes pleasure in, labeling himself a law-abiding citizen. The topic of the greater good is also another recurring theme. In the latter portion of the film, Clyde again calls out Nick for doing what was only in his interest, by taking the deal and not going to trial, an act he labels as for the greater good. Clyde counters that he would have been okay with Nick taking the risk of going to court and would have accepted the outcome regardless. But this is highly doubtful, as nothing but the death penalty for the robbers would have been acceptable to him. Should they have been released on a technicality, Clyde's quest for vengeance would have no doubt still happened. But in light of his actions, where Clyde indiscriminately kills innocent people, one would wonder what his purpose ultimately is. While earlier he declares that he is going to war with the legal system, and with his quoting of von Clausewitz, all he has managed to accomplish is to turn himself into public enemy number one. Nothing has changed in terms of setting a new legal precedent or altering an existing statute. In reality, Clyde's goals are much smaller in scale and more personal, mainly centering around Nick, the man who he deems to have denied him his justice. In a sense, Clyde fulfills the trope of the character who, after one bad day, becomes a villain and challenges the hero to abandon his sense of morality. Not unlike the Punisher or the Joker, although with his current moral state, Clyde would be more reminiscent of the latter. We see this in one of their confrontations, when Nick repeatedly hits Clyde out of frustration. Clyde is actually pleased that the formerly cautious layman is enraged, and tells him that he approves of his anger, saying that it's what's necessary. When Nick's colleague draws his weapon on Clyde, his reaction is insightful. Clyde appears to also be content with this decision and closes his eyes as he prepares for death. If the man had shot Clyde, it would be out of bounds of the law, which is exactly what Clyde wants. Ultimately, Clyde was on a suicide mission. Revenge was the least of his goals. Rather, it was about turning himself into as monstrous a criminal as can be, one that could not be stopped with the confines of the law, one that would leave others no choice but to break the law to stop him. All this would culminate in one inevitable conclusion, that the current state of the law, with its limitations and loopholes, is a poor executor of justice. To a large extent, Clyde was successful in this aspect, as Nick later expresses regret over his actions, confessing that he's lost his way over the years, and perhaps he should have persisted in changing the system instead of allowing it to change him. In his effort to stop Clyde, Nick resorts to bending and eventually breaking the law himself, as seen when he acts on evidence that would be inadmissible in court, and when he violates Clyde's civil rights by breaking into his property. At the end, Nick offers Clyde a final chance at redemption, but sadly the blackness of his own soul kept it from him. There is, however, one silver lining with Clyde. If his goal was to force Nick into circumventing the law to stop him, no other act would fast-track this goal than if Clyde were to target his family. Clyde could have easily done this, as seen by the constant surveillance he has on Nick and his family. But perhaps targeting Nick's family would be too extreme even for Clyde, combined with the fact that it would hit too close to home given his own tragedy. Before his death, he finds consolation that his lesson was learnt, smiling over the fact that Nick resorted to breaking the law to stop him. With Nick becoming the new district attorney, perhaps Clyde can rest in the fact that his new approach would ensure stricter levels of justice. But regardless, Clyde is in agreement that he himself has to die. As in his own words, everyone must be held accountable for their actions. Was his life a tragedy? It surely was. Were his actions justified? Certainly not. At the end, he remains someone who has to be stopped, no matter how pitiable he may be. So what do you think of Clyde Shelton from Law Abiding Citizen? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and take care.